Thank you very much for this very kind introductory words. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's for me really an honor to be invited to deliver after so many distinguished predecessors this 17th Kilbrandon lecture in the honor of Lord Kilbrandon, the child hearing system and all that he has introduced into the child justice system in Scotland. I will present you this little book here that we all together finalized as it is here in November, so it's just only a few months ago, after a collective effort, and that we are now, with all its recommendations, trying to launch around the world. It's a global UN study. Yeah. And as such, it follows two other very distinguished global studies. Grâce Magel, very well known already in 1996, was asked by the General Assembly to write a report on the impact of armed conflict on children, raising awareness about the plight of child soldiers, and that had a major impact. Not only that the UN SISG, a special representative of the Secretary General, was appointed on children in armed conflict, and still today with an office in New York, in order to follow up the study, but the Security Council of the United Nations, the General Assembly and others have taken a lot of action in order to address the situation of child soldiers, and there's definitely progress if you compare the 1990s with today. 10 years later, Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro, a very well-known Brazilian human rights professor and expert, he was the lead author of a global study on violence against children. And again, an SISG, primarily Marta Santos Pais, has been appointed. And if you compare this, now it's 14 years already, much has been done to raise awareness that children shall not be exposed to any form of physical, mental, sexual, verbal or other forms of violence, which are, of course, in the family, it's in the community, in schools, educational institutions, but of course most severe in closed institutions, prisons, etc. And that's why very soon afterwards, non-governmental organizations, but also the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, requested that there should be a follow-up global study that only looks into the deprivation of liberty. So I see it also as a follow-up to violence. I see deprivation of liberty of children as a form of structural violence that is also prohibited under the Sustainable Development Goal number 16.2, no violence against children. And that's why then in 2014, the General Assembly decided to invite the Secretary General to commission a third global study on children deprived of liberty. However, with a little sentence saying, but it has to be paid out of voluntary contributions, not of the general UN budget. And I tell you later a little bit that created some major problems. In a UN task force was established, and Marta Santos Pais was the chair of the task force, where all the main UN agencies collaborated and were part of, and they then developed a budget, they developed a list of persons, and finally I had the honor and pleasure to be asked whether I would like to be the lead author of this, and I happily said yes, because already, and the Dean has referred to my former function as UN Special Rapporteur on Torture between 2004 and 2010, where I carried out 18 official fact-finding missions to countries in all world regions. And if you want to investigate torture, which always takes place behind closed doors, then you spend most of the time on the fact-finding mission in all those different types of institutions: migration-related detention, in prisons, police jails, in various institutions for the elderly, but also for children. And you, of course, interview the detainees, and you realize that detainees are kind of a forgotten, particular vulnerable group. Whatever is the reason that they are there, there's no lobby for persons behind bars, but also not for children behind bars. And for me, it was often most heartbreaking if you see a 3-year-old child somewhere beaten up in an orphanage or whatever, or a 12-year-old child or 8-year-old child, so already being sentenced to a prison term because the minimum age of criminal responsibility is that low. So for me, many of the memories came up, and that was the main reason why I said, if I have this special mandate and I will be able to contribute only a little bit to creating awareness of deprivation of liberty of children and perhaps contributing to a certain reduction, I would be more than happy to do that. So, as I said, in October, I delivered a short report to the General Assembly. That's a classical UN documents, which was a short summary in New York. And in November, on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we presented this book as the full global study. It became a little bit more comprehensive than we envisaged originally. And it's now also available online in an interactive version, so it's very easy to actually load down and interact. Now, why do we need it? The Convention on the Rights of the Child is very, very clear. Adults can be deprived of liberty for all kinds of different reasons. It's one of the major punishments that we have is deprivation of liberty, but whether it's in pretrial detention, police custody, but also for many other reasons. Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights lists a whole group of, a whole list of situations where adults can be deprived of liberty without violating this right. So it should not be unlawful, not arbitrary. But for children, there's an additional, very clear requirement in Article 37b. Deprivation of liberty shall only be for in exceptional circumstances, a measure of last resort. And then, if there are really no non-custodial solutions, then only for the shortest appropriate period of time. This is a very high standard, together with other standards like the best interest of the child, etc. So I think the law is very clear. The reality looks totally different. And I will come back to that, but far too many children are in these different settings, these different situations of deprivation of liberty, but we don't really have reliable statistical data. UNICEF usually said there's about 1 million children, but nobody really knew where they got this data from. Did they only refer to the administration of justice? So that is what usually was told. I think this is the first scientific study, and I say that although the data that we received were far from ideal, far from sufficient, but nevertheless, I think with extrapolation, statistical expertise, we could arrive at fairly reliable, still conservative data that I will show you later. Now, what does deprivation of liberty mean? The study is also, we call it deprivation of childhood. You take away the childhood if you put children, if you lock them up. And we had spoken to so many children who started at an early stage for whatever reasons, because they were taken away from their parents, or they had no parents, or their parents couldn't care for them, but they were not put in foster care or any family type settings, but in an institution, however you call it, children's homes. They have sometimes very beautiful names, but in reality it's deprivation of liberty. And then they experienced lack of love, violence, etc. And then they were moving from one of those institutions to the other. They had behavioral difficulties, they got educational supervision. Finally, they committed some kind of petty crime, and then at a certain point they ended up in the criminal justice system and had spent most of their childhood somewhere behind closed doors. And that leaves a long-lasting mark, not only on the child itself, but on society as a whole. So they should grow up, and that's one of the main messages that we need to support families much more in order to be able to carry out their responsibility under the Convention, to primarily take care for children, and the child welfare system, rather than so in order to prevent that children actually are in any form of detention, because it is counterproductive, it's highly expensive, much more expensive than a well-functioning child welfare system with non-custodial alternatives. It damages their health. We have an own chapter on health and development, and should be avoided as much as possible. Now, the main objectives are very simple. The one was assess the magnitude. We don't know how many children, we would like to know that, but also what are the main reasons, pathways, root causes, why are there so many children deprived of liberty, but also document good practices. Really try to get from states practices that show we have established a certain measure, and you can see in the last 10 years the number of children behind bars really went down by 50% or whatever. To raise awareness, so it is not as a kind of naming and shaming exercise. It's really a much more positive exercise to see what states could learn from other states that have taken certain good practices, and then provide recommendations to states, to the UN agencies, but also to the society at large. Now, those are the main areas. Of course, the administration of justice is one of the most important chapters. It's not seldom, that's a photo I've taken in Togo, because the minimum age of criminal responsibility was 7. And these are 8, 9, 10-year-old children who were already sentenced to imprisonment. National security grounds, now in particular in the age of terrorism, that's particular reasons why children, not only Palestinians, are taken into custody for national security reasons because they are throwing stones at Israeli soldiers. children living in prisons with their primary caregivers. It's a very complex and difficult issue. To what extent shall primary caregivers, and 99% are mothers, be allowed to take, if they actually are imprisoned, to take infants and small children with them into prison. It's a very difficult balancing of interests. What is in the best interest of the child? Then, of course, in the context of armed conflict, child soldiers, usually recruited by non-state actors and afterwards detained by the military. Then a highly controversial issue in times of more and more refugee flows and migration and restrictive policies, that more and more children, whether they are unaccompanied or migrating with their families, are put in migration-related detention. And finally, and that was the most difficult part, institutions, how to define institutions. And those are very different types where children are placed, whether it's special closed care institutions or whether for children who take drugs or alcohol, or for educational supervision, or children with disabilities, still in so many countries in special institutions for these children. And in reality, they are all, or most, all deprived of liberty. So those were the 6 areas that we looked into. And then we also had 4 cross-cutting chapters. The one on the gender dimension, which is both gender identity, sexual orientation, but of course also the relationship between boys and girls. And in the administration of justice, in armed conflict and in national security, the percentage of children detained, the percentage of boys, 94%, compared to 6% girls. It reflects a little bit also adult prisons, but it's even stronger. On the other hand, if you look at research statistical data, about 2/3 of criminal offenses are committed by boys and 1/3 by girls. So why is this gradual? Why is the percentage of boys coming into the criminal justice system who are not diverted or benefiting from diversion? Girls are much easier benefiting from diversion at the different stages than boys. Has also some paternalistic attitudes of male judges, saying the girl should actually be brought home, but the boy should be punished. So it's good to see, but there's very, very little research done on the reasons why boys in this case are discriminated. Girls might also be discriminated for status offenses, etc. But the discrimination of boys has, I think, seldom really been addressed and explained. We had a special working group dealing with the impacts on the physical and mental health of children. The University of Melbourne was leading this research group with a magnitude of data in peer-reviewed journals that looked at from a health perspective on the impact, and the worst impact actually is of migration-related detention. There are very, very good studies in Australia and other countries. Of course, for every research on children, we should include children. Child participation is one of the 4 principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we tried with every regional consultation that we did to include children. For financial reasons, it was not always possible, but we also interviewed, with the help of non-governmental organizations, 274 children in 22 different countries, about their experiences in detention. And of course, children with disabilities is a special chapter because they are overrepresented everywhere, not only in institutions, special institutions for children with disabilities, but also in other institutions, but also in the criminal justice system, and to some extent in migration-related detention. Now, as I told you, the Undersecretary General, originally, before I was appointed, I had nothing to do with that, said, and that was again conservative, that we would need about 4.7 million US dollars in order to have a proper secretariat at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, but also to organize thematic and regional consultations, and of course to do all the research work, etc. At that time, it was only Switzerland that had provided some money so that I could start. But then when that money was gone, we had I organized in Venice, where I'm primarily based, at the Global Campus of Human Rights, an expert meeting in order to develop a questionnaire. I did that immediately in March 2017, after I was appointed. So we developed with statistical experts and methodological experts, with many people, I think a fairly decent questionnaire to be sent out to all member states of the United Nations, but also to UN agencies, to national human rights institutions, ombuds institutions, etc., to get statistical and other data. And when we finally had this questionnaire, the Office of the High Commissioner said, but we have no more money, so we cannot translate it and we cannot send it out. And that was for us a turning point where we said we need to either we stop the whole exercise, states are not interested to fund it, and I did a lot of fundraising before in New York, in Geneva, etc., without any success before. So we did an emergency fundraising campaign, and finally these are the states that we call the friends of the global study that contributed all together about 1/5 of the budget, together with the European Union and UNICEF. But it was by far not enough to finalize such a book. So it would not have been possible without pro bono contributions from hundreds, or more than 100 of researchers, from universities, from non-governmental organizations, from all kinds of sectors of society, who said, we want that this global study continues. We don't want that you give it up. And many people actually said, I mean, if states are not really interested, and the best measurement is, the best indicator is if they don't provide money, I think there's no real backing, so better you give it up. But I'm happy that I didn't, and that we were really lucky that so many people supported us. So that's what I mean, it's a real joint effort. Of course, not all 193 member states of the United Nations responded to the questionnaire, but we got 118 replies relating to 92 countries, almost half of them. Not all of them came from governments, but some from national human rights institutions, national preventive mechanisms, etc. Then we had this UN task force, which was all the major UN agencies, UNICEF, of course, but also the High Commissioner for Refugees, for Human Rights, UNODC, also the Office for Drugs and Crime in Vienna, the International Organization for Migration, World Health, and of course the Committee on the Rights of the Child. We had a beautiful high-level advisory board, again pro bono. We couldn't pay them, even not their travel costs. And Skelton from the University of Pretoria, member of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, is the chair. Malcolm Evans from Bristol University is the vice chair. and many other from all regions of the world contributed to the global study. We had 170 NGOs participating, led by Human Rights Watch and Defense for Children International, many NGOs, small NGOs, bigger ones in many countries really contributed even beyond this panel. So of course also Celsius, the Task Force for Justice, etc., were all so somehow involved in providing data and providing research. Academia, I said already, the Global Campus of Human Rights in Venice, which replaced the European Inter-University Center last year, is a network of 100 universities around the globe. And since I'm Secretary General, I could involve them and also get their voluntary contributions. So that's we established these 10 research groups for the different chapters and coordinated everything at the Boltzmann Institute of Human Rights, where I am the founder of in Vienna, since the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva was no longer able to really provide the substantive coordination. And I told already that many children actively participated. So, of course, the questionnaire is only one source. There are so many other official data available from the websites of governments, in particular in the administration of justice, less in institutions and migration. But of course, we looked at all the state reports to the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the committee's recommendations and conclusions. We had various consultations in different regions of the world. We had specific papers that we commissioned. So we tried to get all data that we consider to be reliable to somehow arrive at our conclusions. And in the conclusions we have to, from a data point of view, we have to distinguish how did we define the concept of deprivation of liberty. So we applied the Havana rules, but also the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture that officially defines deprivation of liberty, but only if it is done on the basis of a decision by a court or other governmental agency. So we had this relationship to governmental deprivation of liberty, which of course excludes various forms of deprivation of liberty, for instance, in the family. We were often asked but why are you not looking into the family? And we said it's not part of this definition, and in addition, it would be very, very difficult to get data. But also we excluded kind of trafficking in children and other criminal activities in relation to children. Of course, if a state is privatizing a prison or an institution, that is still state responsibility by licensing the private prison or at least by acquiescence. So if you take all that together, we came at a figure of 1.5 million children, again the highest number in institutions, and that's really on the basis of a decision. So if a court decides to take a child away from its parents because they are not able to care for the child and puts this child in an institution, then this is on the basis of a court decision. But very often it's not a court decision. Very often it's the parents themselves that feel we cannot deal with this child because it is a child with a disability, or it has behavioral difficulties, it's difficult to educate, it's running away from home, etc. So it's the parents that bring a child into a private or public institution that would not fall under our definition. Administration of justice is a very, very conservative figure, and these are all annual data, so per annum. It's not a snapshot data. And also very conservative, 330,000 in immigration detention. This is only pre-trial detention and imprisonment. Does not include police custody, because there it was very difficult to really get very reliable data. And police custody is often also without a formal decision. Armed conflict, national security, and living with their mothers. But if you look at the real picture, and that is the main figure that we are now using, we are talking about more than 7 million children. Why? Because in fact, in institutions, the number is currently about more than 5 million children are in institutions de jure or de facto deprived of liberty. And the UN Human Rights Committee in the general comment has clearly said in all these institutions, whether they are called closed institutions or not, de facto children cannot leave these institutions at their free will, and that's why they are de facto deprived of liberty. That's why this is such a high number. It's still less than 10 or more years ago, because there is a certain deinstitutionalization process. If we add this one about roughly, and that is again a conservative estimate of children in police custody, then we come to 1.4 million in the administration of justice, and the rest remains the same, but together these are a little bit more, so 7.2 million. Again, this is based on scientific extrapolation, and it is still a conservative figure. Now, quickly, the different types. As I said, institutions is by far the largest, and also our chapter on the health shows that institutions are particularly harmful to children. Institutions have certain characteristics, and that is strict discipline. It's the interest of the institution that is more important than the individual needs of children. Lack of love. One of those children whom we interviewed said in very clear words, he said, even if you are in the worst family, even if you're beaten up by your parents, but at a certain point, your mother, your father brings you to bed and perhaps is reading a book for you so that you can start sleeping, and then perhaps you get a kiss. If you're an institution, they say, now it's 10 o'clock, everybody goes to bed, and if not, then there's a punishment. There is nobody who kisses you or provides you with love, because these are people who might leave tomorrow. You don't have a bonding to any particular person. And that is what characterizes an institution. In addition, of course, there's a lot of violence, inter-children violence, but also violence by those who are responsible, sexual abuse. There are so many investigations in so many different countries now, and I think also in Scotland, if I'm correctly informed, about the abuse of children in institutions in whatever, the last 50 years, etc. We just had one in Austria, in Vienna, which was devastating, what children actually experienced, and that they never dared to talk about it, unless you really carry out a professional investigation. So I agree fully with the UN guidelines on the alternative care of children. They are now 10 years old by the General Assembly, calling for a comprehensive deinstitutionalization policy and finding alternatives in family-type settings or other non-custodial solutions, also to abolish as far as possible classical forms of institutions. Now, in the administration of justice, I told already, what are the main reasons for the overuse? So we still talk about 1.4 million altogether. Again, lack of effective child welfare systems and lack of specific child justice systems. And there is also progress that states adopt specific child justice systems with child courts, with persons, whether it's police officers, prosecutors, judges, that are specifically trained to deal with children in the child justice system, but where you have the possibility of diversion at every stage of the criminal justice system, by the police, by the prosecutors, the judges, and perhaps even after imprisonment by the prison administration. And of course, the child hearing systems in Scotland are a very good example of institutionalized diversion, although very often children end up still in institutions, in closed institutions instead of in prisons. Then tough on crime policies. In many countries, and sometimes it's increasing, states are reducing, Philippines, for instance, just reducing even the minimum age of criminal responsibility, rather than raising it to at least 14 years. That's what the Committee on the Rights of the Child has said. 14 years should be the minimum at which age children should be held accountable before a judicial system for whatever they have done. I know that Scotland has recently raised it to 12 years, but that's higher than England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, who still have 10 years. But these are the lowest in Europe, and the average in Europe is 13.8 years. But as I said, we should have at least 14 years worldwide, according to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. So that's one of the main reasons. Discrimination, lack of resources, but also excessive criminalization, status offenses, very often truancy, running away from home, also certain sexual relations between teenagers, moral crimes, if you think about Islamic states, and many status offenses, so offenses that are only for children, lead to the criminalization of children. Partly we also have very, very long still prison sentences for children. If you remember, the convention says, exceptionally, if there is no other way than to detain a child for the shortest appropriate period of time. And there are still quite a number of states that have life imprisonment. And unfortunately also the United Kingdom and Scotland are among those who in principle also have life imprisonment, which in my opinion definitely violates the standard of the shortest appropriate period of time. We have also countries that still have the death penalty for children. Saudi Arabia, for instance, Iran, and other Islamic states, although this is absolutely prohibited as a norm of jus cogens in international law, and of course also in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So what we need is effective child justice systems. That's the most important, because that allows us for diversion, of course, increase the age of criminal responsibility and decriminalize the behavior of children, and shorten the length of detention. These are, in a nutshell, the most important recommendations in that area. For the primary caregivers, the best, it's quite interesting, there is no specific provision in the Convention on the Rights of the Child or any other treaty, with the only exception of the African Charter for the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which says in principle mothers, and we are talking here primarily about mothers, we got only 7 states worldwide, primarily European states, that allow fathers to take their children with them into prison. But Finland was the only state that provided us with 2 examples. So the last 10 years, there were 2 men who actually had their children with them in prison, simply because there are also no suitable father-child units in male prisons. In female prisons, we find more suitable mother-child units. But the most important is that judges and prosecutors should, when they are sentencing a mother with dependent small children to a prison sentence, always make an impact assessment, always look into what does that mean for the child. Does the child have an alternative? Is there a father who can take care of the child, or grandparents, or others, family members? But if that is not the case, then try to avoid sentencing a mother. And then, if there's really no other alternative than sending the child to an institution, then it's probably better that the mother can take the child into prison. But that, again, has to be done in a child-friendly version. And, of course, it's also very important that from the very beginning, there should be a plan that the mother should then be released together with the child. So there should be not too strict limits, no longer than 1.5 years, if the mother is 3 years in prison, because then it's traumatizing. You are bonding, and then after 1.5 years, the child has to leave the mother, and the mother has to leave the child. So that is, and I think probably the global study is the most comprehensive data collection and research that has ever been done on this particular phenomenon. Migration detention was highly controversial. We said at least 330,000 children are currently per annum in immigration detention. But we followed the clear jurisprudence of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Committee on the Rights of Migrant Workers, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, but also UNICEF, OHCHR, and others who said that, in fact, if you apply the principle of measure of last resort in migration-related detention, there is always an alternative. If you have a child that is very violent, has killed somebody, you might find no non-custodial solution. But a child who has not done anything wrong, rather than irregularly being a migrant with the family or an unaccompanied minor, there is always an alternative. So what we said is that children should never be deprived of liberty simply for migration-related reasons, and our medical research showed that this is particularly harmful to the child's physical and mental health. The Australian Commission on Human Rights, for instance, has carried out 2 landmark studies in Nauru, so the offshore location where many migrants were detained. And they said, and I've spoken to some of those researchers when I was in Sydney recently, they said, we have never seen so traumatized children than that. And that prompted the Australian government to change its policy. So in February this year, and I'm a little bit proud because the process of the study already had a certain impact, because this Melbourne was the leading institution carrying out the research on the impact on health, and the government immediately responded also when I have been there. And in February last year, the last child was taken from Nauru back to mainland Australia, and they are no longer in detention, they are in a community setting where they are not deprived of liberty. So there is also a positive impact already. So what we say, all states should actually stop immigration detention for children. And of course, most states, in particular in Europe and in the United States and Mexico and etc., still do detain children. So that is one of the reasons, I guess, why this study is not very popular among rich countries that usually are the donors for this kind of studies. And of course, some of the worst practices, so the country with by far the highest number of children deprived of liberty for purely migration-related reasons is the United States of America. But also under the Trump administration, you have had this, in my opinion, totally inhuman policies of separating even toddlers, even small infants from their parents and putting them in a different detention than their parents, or deporting the parents back to Mexico or El Salvador or Guatemala, etc. And we have still about 3,000 children that are lost in that system, that are separated from their parents, and you can imagine what that means for both of them, for the children and for the parents. Although officially the Trump administration, after an outcry, changed its policy, but still the consequences are still very, very serious for so many of the immigrants there. In armed conflict, at the time when we did the study, we arrived at 35,000 children, but most of them, 29,000, are relating, or at that time were relating to ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq. If you go, and there was a recent study on, in particular, the north of Syria, where the Kurdish authorities were or are still keeping children there in detention, or in Baghdad. There are terrible conditions, and you have both children who came from Europe or Central Asia or other countries as ISIS fighters with 14, 15, 16 years there, but also children who came with their parents. There were many parents who joined the caliphate with very small children. And the parents might have been killed, and the children are there in detention. And very often also European states are not that happy to take their own children back. So it's a terrible situation, and both, of course, ICRC and many others are trying to find solutions. So for us, but of course that's not only ISIS. We also armed conflict in so many other situations, in Afghanistan, in Nigeria with Boko Haram, etc., where it's children that are recruited by violent groups termed terrorists or extremists, and then afterwards, and they are recruited forcibly. Usually they might commit serious crimes, and they might be forced to commit serious crimes, war crimes, and then they are detained and tortured very often by the military, by government. And I think our main recommendation is that these children should be seen primarily as victims and not as perpetrators. Often they are punished solely for their membership in armed forces, etc. So rehabilitation would be the most important solution. And the same applies finally to national security. So these are also, that's outside of armed conflict for terrorist-related reasons, and very often these are very, very broad anti-terrorist legislation where children, for instance in France, for apology for terrorism, small children have been detained and charged. So again, I think it's the same recommendations that they should be seen primarily as victims. Yeah, shortly, the progress. There has been clear, and I'll show you afterwards, also primarily in Eastern Europe, a lot of progress in deinstitutionalization already over the last 10, 20 years. Also, there are more and more states that have special child justice systems with diversion, and that also led to a certain decrease in the number of children in pretrial detention and imprisonment, as compared to some 10 years ago, when this figure was still about 1 million, we arrived at 410,000. Also, many states are aware that they have to strike a fair balance in this difficult question whether to allow mothers to keep their children in prisons. There are about 24 states, according to our question and our research, that have stopped migration-related detention completely, and others have reduced it. In relation to armed conflicts, this well-known Security Council resolution has provided these handover protocols, and Mali and Chad and other states have signed them, and handing over these children to UNICEF or to other child welfare organizations. And the same, there are some countries, Switzerland, for instance, has a very good return plan for children associated with ISIS that are not put in detention, but subjected to a comprehensive reintegration, resocialization, and re-radicalization, de-radicalization policies. I talked about these 24 states, and you see it's primarily in Latin America, that quite many Latin American states simply do no longer detain children for migration-related reasons. Also in the Southern African region, in Japan, and in Europe, it's only one state, that's Ireland, that has decided to abolish. But as I said, also the United Kingdom, for instance, has reduced the number of children in migration-related detention, as have other European states. With respect to deinstitutionalization, the biggest progress has been in Central and Eastern Europe, which of course has to do also with the fact that during communist times, we all remember these terrible institutions where children with disabilities or other children have been ill-treated and have been just put away. But we have some countries that really have more than 90%. One of them is Bulgaria, and I looked very closely into the Bulgarian situation, but also Poland and Moldova, etc. Georgia is, I think, the number one with 90, has reduced the number of children in institutions by 97%. That's a big progress. But even the Russian Federation, which of course had the highest number, has a reduction of about 47%. So there's quite much ongoing, a little bit less, but also in the former Soviet states in Central Asia. I was recently in Kyrgyzstan, where they do quite a lot in deinstitutionalization. So that is an area, when Paulo Sergio Pinheiro had his study, he talked about 8 million children in institution. We, on the basis of a commission study, arrived at the 5.4 million. So that brings me to the end, dissemination follow-up. We try, although we have very little financial resources, but we have now 2 private donations that are helping us not only to finalize the study, but also to disseminate it. And that is, so we do all kind of international launches, regional launches with a global study toolkit, but also trying to, together with NGOs and with academia and states, to develop national action plans and to see what are the particular problems in a particular region or country, and then to see what would be, where to start in order to implement the recommendations. That's a few of the launches that we did, starting, of course, with the United Nations in New York, but in various countries around the time of the 30th anniversary of the convention. We had a big launch in the Southern African region in Pretoria in December, and we will have another one in Thailand and in Rabat, where that we do in the context of also the Global Campus of Human Rights in Venice. And these toolkits should help actually governments and UN agencies with practical examples to see what they can do in order to implement the recommendations. That's where you find the global study online and in PDF. And we feel, yeah, this is only a first step. It was a long process to get all this data and research together, but the publication of the study is only the beginning of a longer process, and we hope that the United Nations will decide on a proper follow-up mechanism. For lack of money, there won't be another special representative of the Secretary General, I'm afraid, but perhaps there are other ways and means how the United Nations will take up the follow-up to the global study in order to give children back their childhood, and also to comply with the Agenda 2030 to leave no child behind bars. That's my main recommendation. Thank you so much for your attention.